and the simplicity of the argument that somehow we had these, the magic beans of democracy that will go in and remove the top of the head of state, plant these beans, and democracy will flourish not only in Iraq, but throughout the Middle East. It'll just spread magically without considering the soil conditions, whether there's water, whether there's enough sunlight or air or whatever. That kind of lack of thinking through what happens after the initial kinetic operations, which we usually succeed at. But when these wars drag out to periods of months and then years, the groupthink and the quagmire, it's almost inherent in that system. Yeah. And yet when I compare it to the post-war planning for the occupation of Japan, it was a completely different experience. I remember working in the archives and looking at some of the Civil Affairs Division documents, right? They're massive files, starting as early as, I think, 1942, as you mentioned. They were thinking very thoughtfully, how are we going to occupy Japan? I mean, could you talk the contrast of those?
Well, one of the books I did before this, the other book that took way longer than I had dreamed it would take, was a book on Japan immediately after the war, when the Americans occupied the country. And so, again, because I'm watching what's going on in the U.S., and how history is being used, we're fascinated as historians by the uses of history and by the way memory, so-called memory, is used. And the Bush administration and many people used Pearl Harbor and World War II constantly as a proper analogy to the war in Iraq and the war on terror. And it was an absolutely improper, misleading analogy. But then, before the invasion of Iraq, beginning around October 2002, so maybe five months or so before the actual invasion of Iraq, the government, the Bush administration, began to float lines like, Iraq will be like Germany and Japan after the war, that we can turn this horrendous authoritarian, brutal dictatorship into a peaceful, prosperous ally to ourselves and model for Middle East. And that became another mantra, and it was a misuse of history. And I, at that time, but loads of other people, the military was doing their own studies of occupations in occupied areas. Japan and Germany were special cases. Incidentally, not a single GI was killed in the occupation of Germany or the occupation of Japan by hostile Germans or hostile Japanese. Not one. We look back on it now and it's just unbelievable. But we said at the time, look, people like myself, but many of these people in the government, they did terrific work. They just couldn't be heard. Iraq is not Japan, and in fact, what you see that made Japan successful, or Germany, but particularly Japan. Japan was a great image because it was non-Western. You see, Iraq can be like Japan. It's non-Western, it's non-Christian. Everything that made the occupation a success in Japan is absent in Iraq. The occupation will not be legitimate. There will be no existing government to take over. We're going to go in and decapitate the government. Who's going to take over? Who's going to take over? There was no real tradition of civil society to keep going. There was all sorts of things. In Japan, everything carried on, including the emperor. It was a formal surrender. The entire world saw that occupation, including Japanese, as legitimate. It was formal. It was all missing in Iraq with its sectarian schisms, its lack of a real democratic tradition comparable to what Germany and Japan had. Its lack of an ongoing administration was all missing in Iraq, and that was clear before. But people use history as they wish to use history. You know, the old saying is that the politician uses history the way a drunk uses a lamppost for support rather than illumination. And so anyone, and this was coming also from a lot of people who were Middle East and Iraq experts, they were coming in, they were saying Al-Qaeda is an atrocious threat, and Al-Qaeda has to be defeated. What has that got to do with Iraq? If Saddam Hussein is a brutal dictator, but for this, and this reason, you cannot go in and expect to have just a smooth takeover. And so when I look back, thinking, all the things I've read about Japan and other places, the people in the Bush administration are saying, well, here's our war plan. Here's plan A. We're going to go in, topple Iraq, and get out quickly. In quickly, out quickly, leave a small footprint, and the existing government will take over. There is no plan B. I really have read extensively, and everything we can get. There'll never be a U.S. investigation of Iraq the way there was after Pearl Harbor. We'll never get all of those documents. But I've read a lot of it has come out, including people like Douglas Feith and others who have really pushed out a lot of documents. There was no plan B. Sounds just like that general who said we're going to get in and out of China in 4 years. The joke was plan A is to get in and out quickly, plan B is to hope plan A works. That's very close to what the record suggests.
And yet, at relatively high levels, there were two very thoughtful individuals who knew better and who saw a lot of these problems coming well in advance. And I'd like you to compare the two of them. One is Yamamoto, Admiral Yamamoto, and the other is Colin Powell.
Oh, you're very astute. It's a big book, but I actually threw away one gigantic section in the book in which I compared Japan's Holy War with the Islamic Holy War and anti-Western sentiment. It took about a year or a year and a half, and I decided it was too much. Then I threw away paragraphs here and there, and one was comparing the Japanese policymakers and the American policymakers to show the diversity and the capabilities within each side. Also to show the small cabals that were actually making policy on both sides in the imperial presidency and within the emperor system. And the natural comparison, which I then removed from the book, was Colin Powell and Admiral Yamamoto, the man who conceived of and masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the point is that in both cases, you have very, very smart people who on principle were opposed to the wars. Admiral Yamamoto said, you're absolutely making a terrible mistake, he tells his superiors, to go to war against the United States. You can't win. And Yamamoto had been in the U.S. on 2 occasions as a naval attaché. He knew Washington very well. He was an old pro. He went back to the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905, and he was also a very innovative tactician. He says, "You're crazy to do this." Colin Powell, and of course others can speak to Colin Powell better than I, also had grave reservations. When the Japanese said we're going to attack America, Yamamoto said, okay, if you're going to do that, I think we have to attack Pearl Harbor, because the Japanese really wanted to control Southeast Asia. They needed the resources of Southeast Asia so they could prolong the war in China, which had become a quagmire. Quagmires always produce quagmires. There's never an end to this. And Yamamoto said, well, if you attack Southeast Asia, there's the Philippines down there, and America, in all likelihood, will come into the war. We have to have a preemptive attack on Pearl Harbor so that we can delay the American fleet from coming over. And I think if we can pull that off, we can delay the American response for 6 months or a year. That will give us the time to consolidate our position in Southeast Asia, and our hope is that this will demoralize the Americans, and instead of pursuing a long war against us in Asia, they will cut a deal and leave us with some of the things we need for our national security. But he made it very clear that he thought it was a big mistake. Once the war had been decided upon, and he could not control that decision, he would do his best to ensure success in that war. His great contribution, incidentally, was he was an aircraft carrier advocate, and most of the Japanese Navy were battleship admirals. And it was Yamamoto who saw that the future lay with air power and the aircraft carriers and persuaded them they should do this incredibly daring, incredibly bold attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, of course, the Americans said technically and psychologically the Japanese aren't capable of doing this. My impression of Colin Powell, who has been such a great American hero in many ways, is, and I think he says this, he says, well, I talked to the president, I told him my reservations once, on one occasion. It was clear I wasn't going to win, and when your president says to do something, all you can do is salute. And so then we get into nationalism, love of the country, patriotism, that once the machines get going, people get aboard. And so you get into the whole machinery of gearing up to war, which is both material and psychological. And at a certain point, you're supposed to get aboard, and principled criticism is not acceptable. And I think that's another culture of war, you see. And unless we grasp these machineries and these pathologies, well, the coil of war will be with us forever.
No, that's a depressing note. We have 5 minutes to wrap this up, and that's what I want to focus on, is this intersection. We now have not only the groupthink and the bureaucratic momentum, the sheer size of the Pentagon, and the way we waged war, combined with the viciousness of our domestic politics now. We're in election season, silly season. The kinds of smears and negative ads, attacks that go on back and forth makes it very difficult for legislators who are concerned first and foremost with getting reelected, with dealing with serious problems, and the most serious problems are the ones that very often have counterintuitive solutions, right, that are difficult to communicate to the electorate. One of my favorite philosophers, Bart Simpson, right, runs for class president in one of the episodes, and he begins by attacking his opponent in a speech, and he says, "My opponent says there are no easy answers. Well, I say he's not looking hard enough." And that, in a nutshell, is kind of the problem we have with domestic politics today, that they're playing to the lowest common denominator. The knee-jerk solutions are the ones that the electorate, they think, will understand the easiest, and that'll get you the most votes. But the counterintuitive solutions, having a rational discussion, is complicated, and you'll be attacked by your adversaries. So it seems to me, is this new, or is this, has this always been around with us? And what lessons do you have for the future and our politicians today?